Lecture 30, The Dialectic Between the Person and Behavior. Now we're going to return to our three dialectics in social behavior, exploring one dialectic per lecture, beginning with the dialectic between the person and his or her behavior. And we'll begin by continuing with the doctrine of traits, looking at the influence of personality traits and attitudes on behavior. And what this piece of the dialectic is all about is the problem of predictability, as set out in the doctrine of traits. Remember, the doctrine of traits says that traits cause people to behave in particular ways, or at least dispose them to behave in particular ways. And it's because people have personality traits that their behavior is as predictable as it is. So now let's ask the empirical question. To what extent can we predict a person's behavior in some specific situation, given knowledge of his or her generalized personality traits and attitudes? Now first, let's examine a little bit more closely exactly what we mean by this. Remember, in the Big Five structure of personality, we have 5 superordinate traits of personality: neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to experience. And then we have the facets of each of these Big Five nestled underneath as primary traits. And then we have habitual behaviors of a sort that are represented by the specific items in personality questionnaires like the NEO personality inventory. So suppose that we know that a person is extroverted. We can predict from this that this person is going to be generally warm and generally assertive. And given that a person is generally warm, we can predict that he'll like most people and that he'll form strong attachments to friends. And given that a person's assertive, we can predict that she'll be dominant and forceful and usually lead groups of which she's a member. But that's not the question. The question is, how will this person behave in some specific situation? Given that an individual is extroverted, tends to be warm, tends to like most people, will he like some specific person, call her Judy, when he meets her at a party? Given that he tends to form strong attachments to friends, will he still call Judy on the phone when she moves out of town? Given that a person is extroverted, we can expect that she'll be more assertive than average and dominant, and will usually take a leadership position in groups of which she's a member. But when she's at a particular meeting, will she actually interrupt a speaker who's been going on too long? Or will she take over a task when the rest of the group seems to be not functioning properly? Knowing where a person stands on some personality trait, how well can we predict how that individual is going to behave in some specific situation? Just to reinforce the point, suppose we know that a person is highly agreeable. We can predict that he'll be relatively trustworthy or she'll be relatively altruistic. People who are trustworthy tend to believe that most people are honest and they tend to assume the best about people. People who are altruistic tend to be courteous to everyone and they tend to be charitable. But given that a person is agreeable and is trusting and believes most people are honest, will he let some specific coworker actually borrow some money? Given that he assumes the best about people in general, will he still like his coworker when his coworker fails to repay the debt? Given that somebody's agreeable, generally altruistic, more or less courteous to everyone, will she actually say please when she asks a store clerk to get her something? Or will she actually donate to the Salvation Army when she sees the kettle at Christmas time? To what extent can we predict how a person will actually behave in some specific situation, given knowledge of his or her generalized personality traits and attitudes? In some domains, we can make that prediction pretty confidently and pretty accurately. Here are the results of some research by John Jost relating people's political attitudes to their actual voting behavior in presidential elections from 1972 to 2004. In this study, subjects had rated themselves on a dimension of political liberalism or conservatism. In fact, they rated themselves on a 1 to 7 scale of liberalism. And then they rated themselves on a 1 to 7 scale of conservatism. And what Jost found is that across those 9 presidential elections, people's actual voting behavior, whether they voted for the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate, was almost perfectly predicted by how they rated their general political attitudes as liberal or conservative. 80% of people who rated themselves as extremely liberal voted for the Democratic candidate, and those percentages went progressively down as people rated themselves as progressively less liberal. Similarly, 80% of people who rated themselves as extremely conservative voted for the Republican candidate, and those percentages systematically went down as people rated themselves as less and less conservative. The actual correlation between political attitudes and voting behavior, aggregated across the 9 presidential elections, was an extraordinary 0.92. Remember that with correlation coefficients, a perfect correlation is represented by a correlation coefficient of 1.0. So people's general political attitudes, whether they're generally liberal or generally conservative, really do influence their voting behavior. Liberals tend to vote for Democrats, conservatives tend to vote for Republicans, but attitudes like this don't always predict behavior so strongly. An early demonstration of this is a classic study of racial prejudice by Richard Lapierre, a sociologist at Stanford University, performed in the 1930s. Lapierre had the occasion to travel around the country with a Chinese couple, and being a sociologist, Lapierre knew something about the prejudice that white Americans directed towards Chinese at the time. And he was worried about how they would be treated in hotels and restaurants. In fact, they were treated just fine, with only a single exception. Every one of the hotels where they attempted to register actually gave them a room. And without exception, every one of the restaurants that they attempted to eat at actually served them a meal. This surprised Lapierre, so after the tour he went back and surveyed each of these hotels and each of these restaurants, asking them about their policies. The question was, do you accept members of the Chinese race as guests? 43 of the 47 hotels surveyed said no, and so did 75 of the 81 restaurants. But with one exception, every one of the hotels, and with no exceptions, every one of the restaurants actually accepted the Chinese couple as patrons of their establishment. If the business owner's racial attitudes were tapped by this questionnaire, those attitude measurements didn't predict their actual behavior at all. Although the Jost study is very interesting, the Lapierre study seems to be more representative of the attitude-behavior relationship, which is that attitudes are not very good predictors of actual behavior. And since the time of the Lapierre study, social psychologists have been trying to figure out why that's the case. Similarly, it turns out that behavior isn't all that well predicted by personality traits either. Consider, for example, an important study of delay of gratification in young children performed by David Funder and Jack and Jean Block. Delay of gratification has to do with people's ability to tolerate frustration, to control their emotions, and control their impulses. It's a very important aspect of socialization. Every culture requires some ability for ego control on the part of its members. Every culture requires individuals to plan ahead and tolerate delays and control their impulses. This ability is generally acquired early in life as a result of socialization. But of course, even within a culture, individuals will differ in their ability to delay gratification. As traditional personality psychologists might put it, some people have this ability and some people don't. In the Funder study, nursery school teachers administered a test of intelligence to their pupils and also rated their pupils' personalities on an instrument designed to provide 2 measures of very broad traits of personality. The first of these is known as ego control. This has to do with the ability of the child to control his or her impulses, including the ability to delay gratification, inhibit aggression, and engage in planful behavior. The scale for this trait actually includes the item, is unable to delay gratification, among its questions. Ego control measured this way is roughly equivalent to the conscientiousness dimension of the Big Five. The other trait was ego resiliency, which has to do with the ability of the child to adapt to environmental demands, including the child's feelings of security and competence. And ego resiliency is roughly equivalent to the neuroticism dimension of the Big Five. So these were used as the predictor variables in the experiment: rated level of ego control or conscientiousness, and rated level of ego resiliency or neuroticism, as well as the child's IQ score. Okay, so intelligence, ego control, and ego resiliency were the predictors. What were the behaviors that they looked at in this experiment? Well, there were two of them. First, what's known as the gift delay situation. Here, the child was offered a gift-wrapped package and then told that he or she must wait a while before he could open the gift. And the measure of delay of gratification was simply how long the child was able to wait after the experimenter left the room without asking to open the gift. The other situation was known as the resistance to temptation situation. The child was brought into a room that was furnished with toys. One set was very attractive and the other set rather unattractive. The child was told that he or she could play with the unattractive toys, but was forbidden to play with the attractive set on the grounds that they belonged to somebody else. The experimenter then left the room, and the measure of delay of gratification was whether the child played with the forbidden toys anyway, despite having been told not to do so. Remember, these are 4-year-olds in nursery school. Here are the results. It turned out that all 4 of the predictors, IQ, ego control, ego resiliency, and that one specific item, is unable to delay gratification, were significantly correlated with actual delay behavior. The first 3 correlations are positive. The higher the child scored on IQ or on ego control or ego resiliency, the longer he or she was able to delay. The remaining correlation, of course, is negative. The higher the child scored on the particular item is unable to delay gratification, the less time the child was actually able to delay. This study is entirely representative of findings in this area. When we try to predict how a person, child or adult, male or female, is going to behave in some specific situation, knowing what that person is like in general, knowing what his or her personality traits are, that gives us some predictive power, gives us some leverage, but frankly, not very much. Personality in general does predict behavior in particular, but the prediction is relatively weak. This is what we get when we look at the relationship between traits and behavior. And it's also what we get when we look at the relationship between attitudes and behavior. The correlations are often statistically significant, greater than chance, but they're still pretty low. Here's another study by Sampo Paunonen, a psychologist in Canada working with college students now. He administered a questionnaire measure of the Big Five personality traits. In one study, the NEO 5-factor inventory, an abbreviated measure of the Big Five. In the other study, the NEO personality inventory, which is a much more extensive, more comprehensive measure of the Big Five personality traits. And then Paunonen looked at the correlation between those subjects' personality traits and their actual behavior as reported by them in another questionnaire. This table shows about half of the behavioral variables that Paunonen collected data on. The subject's grade point average, the frequency with which they went on dates, and the number of different partners they dated, whether they were smokers and the amount they smoked, whether they chose a liberal arts major or a pre-professional major in college, whether they were interested in joining a fraternity or sorority, whether they had ever been cited for a traffic violation, and their degree of religious interest, basically whether they went to church or temple or synagogue or mosque regularly. And the table also shows the strongest correlation between any of the Big Five personality traits and the criterion behavior. So, for example, in study 1, agreeableness correlated minus 0.24 with GPA, and minus 0.23 with dating frequency, and minus 0.21 with dating variety. The more agreeable the subject was, the lower his or her GPA, the fewer dates she had, and the fewer variety of dating partners. Conscientiousness was negatively correlated with smoking. Neuroticism was positively correlated with interest in joining a fraternity or sorority. Openness positively correlated with having been cited for a traffic violation. Neuroticism positively correlated with religious interest. The first thing to be said is that these correlations are well within the range of those obtained in the Funder study of delay of gratification in 4-year-olds, so there was nothing about testing little kids that led to the low correlations in that earlier study. And just as a reminder, these are the highest correlations, whether positive or negative, obtained in that study. The others were lower. The next thing to say is that the correlations themselves don't always make a lot of intuitive sense. You might think that conscientiousness is correlated with GPA, and it was in study 2, but it wasn't in study 1. It's hard to imagine why agreeableness would be negatively correlated with dating frequency and dating variety, but in any event, those correlations didn't replicate in the second study, and that's the next point to make. By and large, the significant correlations obtained in one study weren't replicated in the other study. The Big 5 personality traits don't seem to be particularly strong predictors of these kinds of behaviors. And the predictions themselves aren't particularly reliable because we don't get the same correlations from one study to the next. There's a pattern emerging here. For the most part, the correlations between personality characteristics in general, whether they're traits or attitudes, and specific behaviors in particular, seem to reach a plateau somewhere in the 20s or the 30s. Such a correlation may be statistically significant, statistically better than chance, but it's not very high. Already in 1968, Walter Mischel, reviewing the literature up to that time, suggested that there was a ceiling or upper limit on the extent to which an individual's behavior in some specific situation could be predicted from knowledge of his or her generalized personality traits. Mischel called this ceiling the personality coefficient, and he set it at about 0.30. That is, if you're going to correlate some measure of personality with a person's behavior in some particular situation, you're probably not going to see a correlation higher than 0.30. And again, while that correlation is statistically significant in these kinds of studies, it's not very large in the absolute scheme of things. A correlation of 0.30 between a trait and behavior means that only about 10% of the variance in the criterion behavior can be accounted for by the personality trait. The other 90% of the variance is unaccounted for. And again, these results are entirely representative of what you get when you do these kinds of studies. There appears to be a ceiling on the extent to which we can predict behavior in a specific situation from knowledge of an individual's general traits and attitudes. Okay, so much for the effects of personality characteristics in general on behavior in particular situations. Now let's look at the reciprocal effect of behavior on the person. How does the person's behavior feed back to shape and influence his or her traits and attitudes? The reciprocal effect of behavior on the person is nicely illustrated by Daryl Bem's self-perception theory of attitudes, which reverses the traditional account of attitude-behavior relations. Common sense and traditional theory tells us that attitudes come first and cause us to behave in particular ways. If I'm a liberal, I'll probably vote for the Democratic candidate in an election. If I'm high in ego control, I'll probably be able to delay gratification, at least for a while. My traits and my attitudes cause me to behave in particular ways. But at least as far as attitudes are concerned, Daryl Bem argued that the actual direction of causality might be reversed, that behavior causes attitudes to form. Specifically, Bem argued that we infer what our attitudes are from observing our own behavior. This is exactly the thing we do when we infer other people's attitudes from observations of their behavior. And Bem simply said, that's how we get our own attitudes as well. Put another way, our perception of our own behavior leads us to form attitudes that are consistent with that behavior. In this sense, the behavior comes first and the attitude comes later. It's a very provocative idea. Self-perception theory is nicely illustrated by what's known as the foot-in-the-door effect on compliance. In a classic study, Friedman and Fraser canvassed neighborhoods under the guise of the California Safe Driving Campaign. They asked homeowners in a random half of households in a particular neighborhood to sign a petition in support of safe driving. The canvassers didn't request any donations for that campaign, just signatures. And, in fact, almost everybody they asked complied with this request. After all, nobody's opposed to safe driving, even in California. Later, the canvassers returned to all the households in that neighborhood and asked permission to place a large, rather unattractive poster in their front yards promoting the campaign, the kind of thing that would make property values instantly take a dip. Remember now that everybody who'd been asked to sign the petition did so. The question now is, how many will agree to have this sign put in their front yards? In fact, homeowners who had earlier signed the petition were more likely to agree to have the poster in their front yards than those who had not been asked to sign. The trick in the experiment, of course, is that almost everyone who had been asked to sign the petition actually did so. So it was unlikely that there was any difference between the two groups in terms of their support of safe driving. Rather, it appears that the act of signing the petition made homeowners more likely to permit the poster. The explanation goes as follows. Those who had actually signed the petition began to develop an attitude around that fact. It's as if they said to themselves, "Ooh, I signed this petition. I really must be in favor of this safe driving campaign." Then, when they were asked to post a sign, they tended to agree because they believed they were really in favor of the safe driving campaign. But the attitude about the safe driving campaign was formed in the first place after the behavior of signing the petition, not before. The people who hadn't been asked to sign the petition in the first phase of the experiment didn't have this behavior to look back on. They didn't have this experience, so their attitude apparently wasn't too strong. Notice that this study actually illustrates both directions of the reciprocal relation between personality and behavior. In this case, the behavior of signing the petition shaped a positive attitude toward the safe driving campaign. And this positive attitude towards the safe driving campaign then made it more likely that people would agree to post a sign. The behavior shaped the attitude, and then the attitude disposed people toward the behavior. This is known as the foot-in-the-door effect. Granting a small favor makes it more likely that the person will later grant a large favor. The small favor starts the process of forming an attitude that will later dispose the person towards the large favor. In another study, Robert Cialdini and his colleagues recruited subjects for an experiment by telephone. Some subjects were informed that the experimental session was scheduled for 7 a.m. before they agreed to participate. Others were given this information afterwards. Of course, some subjects in the first condition, who were told at the outset that the session was scheduled for the early morning, didn't agree to participate. But in this experiment, we're interested only in those who actually agreed to come to the experiment, and the question is, how many subjects who agreed to participate actually appeared? At first glance, the results of the experiment may seem a little puzzling. It turned out that more subjects who agreed after learning the experiment was scheduled for 7 a.m. actually showed up, compared to subjects who had been told that at the outset. But if you look at it from the point of view of self-perception theory, the result's not puzzling at all. Agreeing to participate creates a kind of foot in the door, and increases the likelihood that the subject will take the more arduous step and actually show up for the experiment. Agreeing to the experiment, like granting a small favor, creates a positive attitude towards the experiment, and that positive attitude makes it more likely that the person will agree to the big favor and actually show up. Here's one more illustration of self-perception theory at work, an experiment by Chaikin and Baldwin on attitudes. In this study, the subjects first completed a questionnaire that was concerned with their attitudes toward environmental conservation. When this questionnaire was scored, it turned out that some subjects have very strong pro-environment attitudes, and others, amazingly enough, were strongly opposed to environmental conservation efforts, mostly on economic grounds. But then again, there were other subjects who had very weak, inconsistent attitudes about environmental conservation. All the subjects then completed a questionnaire in which they were asked to report on their specific conservation-relevant behaviors. The questionnaire came in two versions. Half the subjects received a version that encouraged them to reflect on their pro-conservation behaviors. For example, it contained a question that asked them whether they frequently did not litter. The other half of the subjects received a version of the questionnaire that was carefully worded in such a way as to encourage them to reflect on their anti-environmental behaviors. For example, a questionnaire item that asked them whether they did in fact litter on occasion. The purpose of this questionnaire was to manipulate the salience of pro- and anti-environmental behaviors. After completing the second questionnaire, the subjects then received yet another test of their attitudes about environmental conservation. And the question was whether reflecting on their pro- or anti-ecology behaviors would change their attitudes. And, in fact, this manipulation did change the attitudes of those subjects who had weak, inconsistent attitudes at the outset. Those who were encouraged to reflect on their anti-environment behaviors actually became more strongly opposed to environmental conservation, while those who were encouraged to reflect on their pro-environmental behaviors became more strongly favorable. No such shift occurred in those who already had strong attitudes either way. But for those who had weak, vague, inconsistent attitudes about environmental conservation before the experiment began, their reflections on their own behavior appear to have created attitudes that did not exist before. Let me just note in passing that the Chaikin-Baldwin experiment provides an example of what's known as a person-by-situation interaction, which we discussed 2 lectures ago. Attitude strength is a feature of the person. Reviewing one's past experiences is a task set by the situation. The task affected people's attitudes, but only for those who had weak attitudes to begin with. People with initially strong attitudes about the environment, whether pro or con, were pretty much unaffected by the experimental manipulation. But the important point here is that for those who had weak attitudes about environmental conservation at the outset, reflecting on their behavior changed and strengthened those attitudes. For these subjects, at least, the behavior came first and the attitude came second. Which is what self-perception theory is all about. There are lots of experiments like this, and by and large they tend to support the self-perception theory of attitudes. To some extent, at least, people infer their own attitudes from observations of their own behavior, which is just what we do when we try to infer other people's attitudes from observations of their behavior. Bem's position is that attitudes don't cause behaviors to occur, but rather that behaviors cause attitudes to form. The implication is that people don't really have attitudes, and again, that may be too strong. We don't have to follow Bem all the way to that conclusion. The important point here is that, to some extent, attitudes do cause people to behave in ways that are consistent with the attitudes they've got. But it's also the case that people's attitudes are shaped by the behaviors that they engage in. There's a reciprocal relationship between attitudes and behavior. The reciprocal effect of behavior on the person is also illustrated by the James-Lange theory of emotion, which we discussed in an earlier lecture. To review, traditionally we think of our behaviors as caused by our internal emotional states. When we see the bear, in James's famous formulation, we run because we are afraid. But James reversed the direction of causality. In his view, emotion results from the perception of our own bodily responses to a stimulus. To continue James's formulation, when we see the bear, we're afraid because we run. So in the traditional view, an emotional stimulus elicits an emotional state on the part of the person, and that emotional state causes him or her to behave in such a manner as to cope with the stimulus or express the emotion. The emotion causes behavior. James's revisionist view reverses the direction of causality. He argued that the stimulus elicits behavior from the person, and the perception of the behavior causes the emotional state. The James-Lange theory of emotion finds its strongest modern expression in the facial feedback hypothesis originally proposed by Sylvan Tompkins in the early 1960s. Recall from the earlier lecture on emotion that Darwin in the 19th century and Paul Ekman in the 20th century argued that there were certain basic emotions whose facial expressions were pre-wired, innate. Because they're innate, these facial expressions of basic emotion were universal among humans. They're found in tribesmen in New Guinea as well as college students in San Francisco. But based on the principle of evolutionary continuity, Ekman, like Darwin, also argued that these facial expressions were shared with other animals, particularly mammals. Now, of course, the whole idea of a facial expression of emotion implies that the emotion comes first and the expression comes later. But even Darwin had entertained a weak version of the facial feedback hypothesis, which basically said that the expression of an emotion would modulate, enhance, or inhibit an emotion that was already present. In this weak version, the emotion causes the expression, and feedback from the expression enhances the emotion. Or if you inhibit the expression, then the emotional state itself would be reduced. The stronger version states that a facial expression of emotion is sufficient to create the emotion out of whole cloth. Expression doesn't simply modulate an emotional state that's already present, it can create that state. The implication is that if we could get people to pose various expressions of emotion, they might actually come to feel the corresponding emotional state. This hypothesis that facial feedback can at least modulate and perhaps create corresponding emotional states has been explored and documented in a number of experiments, and I'll show you the first of these. It's a study by Duclos, Laird, and their colleagues, conducted under the guise of a psychophysiological experiment. These investigators used the electromyogram, the EMG, to record the activity of the subject's facial muscles. The subjects were recruited for an experiment on facial action, and in the guise of calibrating the equipment, Duclos and Laird induced subjects to move their facial muscles in such a way as to mimic the facial expressions of emotion documented by Ekman and others. You can get a sense of what they did if you take a moment now and take your pen or your pencil and hold it between your teeth. When you do that, you do a pretty good job of mimicking the facial expression that's associated with happiness. Now take that same pen or pencil and hold it between your lips. When you do that, you do a pretty good job of imitating the facial expression associated with sadness. Now, Duclos and Laird didn't use a pen or a pencil for this purpose. They simply instructed subjects how to adjust their facial muscles so as to create certain poses, and at the same time they collected ratings of the subject's moods. And the question is, would the subject's moods reflect the facial expressions that they were posing? And, in fact, the results of the experiment were pretty much as predicted by the facial feedback hypothesis. When subjects mimicked the facial expression of fear, they tended to feel afraid. When subjects mimicked the facial expression of anger, they tended to feel angry. When they mimicked the facial expression of disgust, they tended to feel a mix of anger and disgust. And when they mimicked sadness, they actually felt sad. Overall, the results of the experiment were exactly in line with the facial feedback hypothesis. On the assumption that these subjects weren't in any particular mood when they arrived in the laboratory, and after all, they were randomly assigned to conditions, the facial expression appeared to create the mood out of whole cloth, created an emotional state that was not present prior to the expression. After self-perception theory and the James-Lange theory of emotion, A third area where we can see the effects of behavior on the person is in the literature on what's known as perceived self-efficacy. Self-efficacy, a term that was coined by Albert Bandura, refers to a person's belief or expectation that he or she can act effectively to bring about desired results. If you're in a race, you believe that you can win, or at least place in the top 50%. If you're taking an exam, it's your belief that you can get an A on the exam, or at least do better than the average person in the class, or whatever. Bandura's point is that perceived self-efficacy can be an important determinant of whether people engage in the behavior to begin with. If you don't believe you can succeed in a task, you may not even try. So in a sense, if a person is going to engage in some behavior to achieve some outcome, then efficacy expectations moderate that behavior. They stand in between, if you will, the person and behavior, and determine whether the person is going to engage in the behavior to begin with. So where do these self-efficacy expectations come from? Now remember that Bandura is a social learning theorist, so he stresses the role of vicarious experience. If you see somebody who's like yourself, and who is also succeeding at some task, then you begin thinking that you can succeed at that task too. Or verbal persuasion, where someone, your coach, your teacher, your parents, tells you that you can do something. Emotional arousal can also be important. People who are happy or in a positive mood state typically have higher self-efficacy expectations than people who are depressed or in negative mood states. But Bandura also argued that performance accomplishments themselves can be sources of self-efficacy expectations. If you try something initially and you succeed, then you acquire an expectation that the next time you try that thing, you'll succeed as well. When people acquire a new skill, they often start out slowly. It's important just to finish the race or complete the task. Once you know you can do that, then you can set your sights a little bit higher. This often happens in psychotherapy, where one of the jobs of the therapist, from a cognitive behavioral point of view, is to persuade the patient that he or she can overcome whatever problem it is that brought him or her in for treatment. And one of the ways that therapists have of doing that is giving the patient homework assignments to go home and try the thing out, even just a little bit, under very protected circumstances. And if it works, then you go home the next time and you try something that's a little bit harder. So efficacy expectations are important causes of behavior because they help determine whether the person's even going to engage in the behavior to begin with. But once the person's engaged in the behavior and it succeeds even just a little bit, the success of that behavior will feed back to shape the person's efficacy expectations. The person learns by getting feedback from his or her own behavior that he or she can actually do the thing that he or she wants to do. The idea that our own behavior can feed back to affect our emotional states, our goals, our motives, our expectations, our attitudes, and other aspects of personality is beautifully expressed in a song from The King and I, a musical comedy by Rodgers and Hammerstein. The musical is based on the true story of Anna Leonowens, a widowed Englishwoman who, from 1862 to 1866, served as tutor to King Rama IV, King of Siam, now known as Thailand. In the play, as Anna and her son approach the wharf in Bangkok, her son asks her if she's afraid of what will happen in her new job in such a strange country. She confesses to a little fear, but then she shares the strategy that she uses to control her feelings. Make believe you're brave, and the trick will take you far. You may be as brave as you make believe you are. Next time, we'll look at the dialectic between the environment and behavior. But first, let's go out with a little music. Here's Gertrude Lawrence from the original cast recording.
Whenever I feel afraid, I hold my head erect and whistle a happy tune, so no one will suspect I'm afraid. While shivering in my shoes, I strike a careless pose and whistle a happy tune, and no one ever knows I'm afraid. The result of this deception is very strange to tell, for when I fool the people I fear, I fool myself as well. I whistle a happy tune, and every single time the happiness in the tune convinces me that I'm not afraid. Make believe you're brave, and the trick will take you far. You may be as brave as you make believe you are. You may be as brave as you make believe you are. By shivering in my shoes, I strike a careless pose and whistle a happy tune, and no one ever knows